World Stories Series Episode 3. The Mountain Road He Never Chose. A Japan episode. Set in Hakone and the Fuji Five Lakes region, Japan. Chapter 1. The Road Through the Cedar Forest. The forest road that runs from the Hakone side of the mountains toward Lake Saiko is not on most navigation systems. It appears on old prefectural maps as a forestry service road, unpaved for the last 12 kilometers, wide enough for a single vehicle, used primarily by the crews who manage the cedar plantation that covers the upper slopes in long, orderly rows that give way, further up, to older, wilder growth where the cedars have had decades to do as they chose. The road has no name. It has a number on the prefectural register, a classification, a maintenance schedule that is observed with what might generously be called intermittent commitment. It is the kind of road that exists on the margins of official geography, known to the workers who use it and to no one else of any consequence. Yuki Kenji took it because the man who had given him the route, a logistics director named Furukawa, who had been with Ishida Holdings for 9 years and who was, as it turned out, simultaneously working for the consortium that had been assembling against the company for 14 months, told him it was the fastest way through the mountains. Furukawa had said this with the careful casualness of a man presenting a perfectly reasonable suggestion, and Kenji had accepted it as such, which was the particular kind of error that occurs when a man trusts something that has earned his trust through years of consistent reliability, and the thing stops being reliable in a way that has not yet been detected. Furukawa was not the fastest way through the mountains. He was the most isolated. The afternoon light was already thinning when Kenji turned off the paved prefectural road and onto the forestry track. The transition was immediate and total. The cedar trunks closed in on both sides of the car within 30 meters of the turn, rising 20 meters and more into the canopy above, so close to the road edge that he could have touched them through the window without fully extending his arm. The bark was dark and furrowed, deeply channeled, and where the car's headlights caught it, because he had switched them on already, the canopy blocking the last of the late afternoon sun with thorough completeness, it turned a color between red and gold, vivid against the dim interior of the forest. He noted this without particular sentiment. He was driving, and he noted what was relevant to driving. What was relevant to driving, increasingly, was the road surface. He had driven difficult roads before, mountain roads in Nagano, coastal roads in Wakayama, where the edge dropped to the sea without ceremony, gravel roads in Hokkaido in early spring when the frost had made the packed surface treacherous. He had driven them the way he drove most things, with full attention, calibrated speed, an understanding of the relationship between what the road was doing and what the car needed him to do. It was one of the few activities in his life that was entirely present tense, entirely physical, requiring nothing from him that was not in that moment and on that surface. He found it restorative in the way that very few things still were. The surface was changing. He felt it before he consciously analyzed it, a shift in the quality of the contact between the tires and the road, a slight loosening, a granular give where there had been packed resistance. The road had been adequate, if not comfortable, for the first 8 kilometers. Now it was becoming something else. Rockier, less maintained, the surface varied in a way that suggested infrequent use and no recent grading. Stones had worked themselves to the surface in places. In others, the road had developed a shallow channel along the center where water ran in the rain and took material with it when it went. He slowed and watched the road ahead in the headlights. The fog had begun to settle in the lower hollows between the cedars. It moved in slowly, without drama, pooling in the dips and depressions of the forest floor in a way that made the ground appear, in the headlights, to be floating. He could see it gathering at road level in places, wisps first, then patches that the car moved through with a slight dimming of the light ahead, then longer stretches where the visibility contracted to 30 meters, then 20. He knew what this meant in the context of a mountain forest at this hour in late autumn. It was going to get significantly worse, and it was going to do so quickly. He was considering the option of turning back when the bend presented itself. It was a narrow right-hand curve where the road passed between a rock face on the left, granite, pale, and permanent, the stone of the mountain itself coming through the thin topsoil of the forest slope, and a deep drainage channel on the right. A concrete-lined cut that ran alongside the road for 10 meters before disappearing under the forest floor. The channel was dry. The road at the apex of the curve was, he estimated, approximately 4 meters wide. 2 vehicles were parked on the road beyond the bend, nose to nose, their lights off. 3 men stood on the road between them. They were not standing casually. They were positioned with a deliberateness that he understood in the first second and confirmed in the second second and acted on in the third, which was all the time available. He did not stop. He had not survived 22 years in business by being slow to understand the nature of the problem in front of him, and the nature of this problem was immediate and clear. The road ahead was blocked. The men were there by design. And stopping would give them what they had come for. He went left, between the rock face and the near vehicle, where the gap was not technically sufficient, but was closer to sufficient than the alternative. He took it at speed. He heard the passenger side of the car contact the concrete edge of the drainage channel, not a single impact, but a sustained, grating contact as the side of the car rode the edge, and then the car tilted and the tilt became something else. Something that could not be corrected, and the world began to rotate. The roll was not violent in the dramatic sense. There was no explosion of glass, no film moment violence. It was deeply disorienting in a way that violence rarely manages and physical dislocation always does. The horizon rotating away, the airbag deploying with a force that was more pressure than impact. The cedar branches cracking against the glass in quick succession as the car descended the embankment. The smell was immediate and specific, pine resin from the cedars, cold earth, and something metallic that he registered without yet having time to examine. Twice the world completed its rotation. Then the car came to rest on its roof in the cedar undergrowth 15 meters below the road, and there was stillness. He was upside down, suspended by the seatbelt, conscious. He checked his hands first, both responding, both able to grip. His right shoulder ached where it had contacted the door at some point in the rotation. He noted this without lingering on it, because the shoulder was a secondary concern. He released the seatbelt and fell to what was now the ceiling and lay there for a moment in the dark and the cold and the cedar smell that was everywhere, rich and clean, the broken branches releasing their resin directly into the enclosed space of the car. The engine had stalled. One headlight was still functioning, its beam casting a pale, slightly diffuse cone into the cedar undergrowth on the downhill side, illuminating the root systems and the fallen needles and the fog moving through the trees with total indifference to what had just occurred. His phones were both in his jacket pocket. He reached them and found them. One screen shattered, non-functional, the second unbroken, but showing no signal whatsoever. He held it in the direction of the light as though this would help, which it did not. He put them both away. He looked at the back seat, which was now, from his current position, above him, and saw the laptop bag, still there, the zipper intact, the bag having wedged itself against the door in a way that had prevented it from falling when the car inverted. The hard drive was in that bag. 14 months of assembled legal evidence against the consortium's market manipulation case. The evidence that made the difference between criminal exposure for 3 of the consortium's principals and a case that would be quietly absorbed, managed, and eventually made to disappear by the consortium's very capable legal team. He lay on the ceiling of his inverted car in a cedar forest 15 meters below a mountain road and considered the situation with the particular clarity that arrives when the situation has reduced itself to its essential components and all the surrounding noise has been removed. He could hear, Distantly, the sound of the men's vehicles on the road above, engines running, a brief exchange of voices, the sound of doors. Then, after a long minute of complete attentiveness, the sound of them leaving. He understood this. They believed either that the hard drive had been destroyed in the crash, or that he would be found too late for it to matter, or both. They were men who had been paid to intercept and leave, and they had intercepted, and now they were leaving. He lay still and listened until the engine sounds were gone and the forest had closed back over the silence. An owl called once, from somewhere in the direction of the ridge above and to the northwest, a single clear note that the cedars carried without distortion. Then nothing. The cold came in through the cracked side window with the slow deliberateness of something that knows it has time, that has always had more time than anything else in the forest, that will be patient because patience is what the cold has always been. He pulled his jacket tighter. He thought about the hard drive. He thought about Furukawa. He let both thoughts settle because there was nothing to be done about either of them until morning, and morning was a long way away. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Reads the Forest. Hayashi Yuki woke at 5 in the morning the way she always woke at 5 in the morning, not from alarm, not from obligation, but from the body's own preference. Established over 11 years into something so consistent that it no longer required an act of will. She lay for a moment in the dark of the sleeping room, listening. The farmhouse was quiet in the specific way it was quiet before dawn, the iron stove in the main room cooling toward morning, the cedar forest outside settling into the hour before the birds began. She had learned, over 11 years, to distinguish the quality of the silence here from all other silences she had known. This one had depth. It had what she thought of, privately, as vertical dimension, the sense that the quiet extended not just across the forest floor, but upward into the canopy and beyond it into the sky. She dressed in the dark, which she had become very good at. Warm base layer first, the motion of her right arm slower than her left, but reliable within its limits. Fleece over the base layer. The yukata left on the low chest. She did not require light for any of this. The farmhouse had the advantage of constancy. Everything in it was where she had put it, and she had put everything in its place with some deliberateness. Because a space in which things were where you expected them was a space in which the cane was not fighting your environment, but only managing it. She made bancha on the iron stove in the kitchen. Coarse tea, deeply grounding, the kind of tea that does not ask anything of you and does not try to be interesting. She had drunk it every morning for 11 years and had never tired of it, which was one of the several ways in which bancha was superior to ambition. She carried the mug to the low table by the window that faced the cedar forest and sat with her legs folded, the cane laid across the table edge within reach, and she opened the sketchbook. She had been drawing this forest for 11 years. The sketchbook on the table was the 37th. She filled approximately 3.5 sketchbooks a year, not because she drew obsessively, but because she drew regularly, which is a different thing. The view from the window changed with the season and with the hour in ways that she had come to consider essentially inexhaustible. The light on the cedar bark in summer was entirely distinct from the light on it in autumn, which was distinct from the winter light, which was a different species of observation altogether. She said, when people asked, and there were occasionally people to ask, visitors who came for a piece and stayed for tea and ended up sitting at the low table longer than they had planned, that she had not finished learning the forest yet. She was always serious when she said this. The forest was the most complex thing she had ever attempted to understand, and she had not been attempting it for nearly long enough. This morning she did not draw. She sat with the mug and looked at the forest and thought about the sound she had heard at 11:30 the previous night. It had come from the direction of the upper road, northwest, she had estimated, above the second ridge. A sound of impact, followed by a secondary sound, followed by a period of engine noise and then silence. She had stood at the window for a long time afterward, long enough for the cold to work its way through the shoji screen and into the main room, long enough for the kettle to come fully to the boil on the stove and then begin to quiet again as she forgot to attend to it. She had heard nothing further. She had made barley tea and sat with it until midnight, and at midnight she had gone back to bed. Because there was nothing she could do in the dark and the fog about a sound she had heard from the direction of an unpaved road 12 kilometers from the nearest paved surface. And she knew the difference between appropriate concern and the kind of concern that exhausts itself against things it cannot presently change. At 5, sitting with the bancha and the 37th sketchbook, she made a decision. She would go and look. She dressed properly for it. Warm base layer, which she already had on. The fleece. The waterproof overjacket with the deep pockets that held, on forest walks, a folding knife, a small torch, a tin of the barley sugar she ate against the fatigue that gathered in her legs on difficult terrain, and a length of cord that she had carried on forest walks for 9 years and had needed twice. The Hakama-style trousers she preferred for forest walking, loose through the leg, gathered at the ankle, allowing the full articulation of the hip she needed when the right side required careful management. The leather boots that had been resoled 4 times and smelled, when she put them on in the morning, of cedar and earth and oil in a combination she had come to associate with almost everything she valued. She took the white oak cane from beside the door. She told the stove she would be back by 9. The stove, as it always did, accepted this information without comment. The pre-dawn cedar forest was a different world from the one visible through the farmhouse window. It was not dark in the way that rooms are dark, it was dark the way the forest is dark, which involves a quality of depth rather than merely an absence of light. The trees stood in it like columns of a vast, roofless hall, 20 meters high, close enough together that the path between them was a negotiated space rather than an open one. The canopy above so dense that on a still night the stars were visible only in fragments. She could smell the cedars before she was through the farmhouse gate. The cold had concentrated their resin, sharpened it, made the smell something that seemed almost physical, as though the forest were something you moved through rather than merely walked in. She walked with the cane on her left, the side where the coordination remained, 11 years on, something she managed rather than something she simply had, and with the particular quality of attention she had developed for forest walking in the dark. It was not the heightened alertness of anxiety. It was something calmer and more complete, a full sensory availability, the kind in which the body accepts information from the ground through the soles of the feet and from the air through the skin and from the sound quality of the forest, which changes depending on what is ahead and what is behind and what the wind is doing in the upper canopy. The path was invisible to her eyes, which did not matter, because she knew it the way she knew the interior of the farmhouse, by position, by the particular feel of each section underfoot, by the way the slope changed at the second turn and again at the point where the path crossed the shallow seasonal stream. She had walked it in every weather. She had walked it in snow once, 2 winters ago, when the snow was 15 centimeters deep on the forest floor and each step required its own assessment, and she had been slower than she liked, but she had not stopped. She found the drainage channel at 20 past 6. She found the tire marks at the road edge in the first thin light of dawn, which was not yet enough light to see by with any certainty, but was enough to make the disturbed earth visible as a darker band against the road surface. She stood at the edge of the embankment and looked down, and 15 meters below she saw the pale shape of a car on its roof in the cedar undergrowth, and one headlight, still burning, its beam angled into the forest floor. She stood very still for a long moment. She did this before beginning any piece of work, before centering the clay, before making the first mark on the sketchbook page, before choosing which path to take in uncertain conditions. It was not hesitation. It was the gathering of herself before the beginning, the practice of seeing what was actually there rather than what she expected or feared or hoped. What was actually there, she assessed, was a car on its roof, stable, not at risk of further movement, no smoke, no fuel smell on the clean cold air. One person visible through the cracked side window, lying still, but with the quality of stillness that is not unconsciousness, but waiting. A headlight that had been burning since at least 11:30 the previous night and was still burning now, which told her something about the car's electrical system and something about how long he had been there. She turned her attention to the embankment and began to look for the way down. Chapter 3: The Descent and the Decision. The embankment was not vertical, but it was close enough that a direct descent was not possible, not for her and not even, she estimated, for most people without equipment. The face was steep, 50 degrees, perhaps 55 in the upper section, and covered in a dense tangle of cedar undergrowth that had come down with the car and then settled in the way that disturbed things settle. Not into order, but into a different kind of disorder. Beneath the undergrowth, the leaf matter was deep and frost-slicked in the early morning cold, each footfall requiring its own assessment of what was underneath. She traversed slowly, moving across the face rather than down it, using the cane as a third point of contact on the slope, finding footholds in the root systems of the cedars that protruded from the embankment face in thick, reliable knots. She was not in a hurry. She understood, from her assessment at the top, that he was alive, that the car was stable, and that the situation did not require the kind of urgency that leads to falls. What it required was the kind of carefulness that takes the time it takes, and she was very well practiced at that. She descended in a long diagonal, covering approximately 40 meters of horizontal distance to descend the 15 meters of vertical, and she used every meter of it to continue her assessment of what was below her. The car had settled deeply into the cedar undergrowth, the roof compressed slightly on the uphill side where it had taken the greatest impact of the initial landing. The windows on the passenger side were cracked in a pattern that suggested sustained contact with something solid, the drainage channel edge, she reasoned, tracing the trajectory of the marks on the embankment face above. The driver's side windows were largely intact, the glass cracked but not fully broken. Through the driver's side window she could see him clearly now, a man, large-framed, lying on the inverted ceiling with his knees slightly bent and his jacket drawn tight, awake and watching her approach with an expression that, at 5 meters, she read as alert, controlled, and in moderate pain. She called to him in Japanese from 5 meters away. She said his name was not yet important and asked him instead to show her his hands. He understood immediately and raised both hands, moving them at the wrist and making a fist with each, which told her what she needed to know about gross motor function. She came the remaining 5 meters and crouched at the window. The crouching was difficult with the cane, and she braced it in the leaf matter at an angle before lowering herself, taking her time about it, and she looked at him through the cracked glass, and he looked at her. She asked about his legs. He moved them. She asked about pain. He described his right shoulder and the back of his head. She noted the shoulder and set aside the head for the moment as something to watch rather than something immediately actionable. She asked him, with the practicality she brought to all things that needed to be accomplished, "Can you come through the window?" He assessed the window opening. It was a manual window that had come partially down in the crash and could be worked the remaining way down by hand, and said he thought so. He was not a small man, and the window opening, even fully lowered, was not generous. She guided him with specific instructions, delivered calmly and without urgency. Angle the right shoulder downward first, because that would allow the chest to follow. Bring the left arm through before the head. When the torso was through, pause and let her know before moving the lower half. He followed each instruction exactly, which she registered. There was a moment where the hip caught the window frame and she said, "Rotate left slightly," and he did, and it cleared. When he was through and on the slope, she held the cane horizontally at arm's length, braced with her back against the cedar trunk behind her, and he gripped it and used it to get himself upright. He was on one knee for a moment on the cedar slope, the knee sinking into the leaf matter, both hands on the cane. He looked at her. He looked at the cane in his hands. He looked at the embankment above them, the steep face, the frost-slicked undergrowth, the 15 meters of vertical that stood between him and the road, and then back at her, and she watched him perform the same rapid assessment she had performed. This is what we have. This is what it will require. This is how long it will take. She said, "We will go slowly." He said, "I can see that will be necessary." It was not sarcastic. It was a simple observation of the objective reality of the slope, the frost, and the particular physical characteristics of the two people who were about to attempt to ascend it. She almost smiled at it. She turned toward the embankment instead, and he rose to his feet, and they began. She showed him where to put his hands. At the root of the first large cedar, where the root system created a natural ledge, grip there at the base of that root, where it has the most resistance. At the transition from the cedars to the bare rock section of the face, not the rock, which was frost-covered and offered nothing, but the cedar stems growing in the crack at the base of the rock section, which were deeply rooted and would hold his weight without difficulty. She talked him through each section as they came to it, without wasted words, and he listened and followed and did not ask questions that were not immediately necessary. Her right arm was not fully reliable for load-bearing. This was a fact she had managed for 11 years through position and technique and an understanding of what her body could and could not be asked to do. On the embankment, she managed it by always ensuring that when she reached upward, the right hand was placed for stability rather than for force. And the force came from the left arm and the left leg and the placement of the cane in whatever anchor point was available. He watched this without comment. He was, she noted, a careful observer. They came up in 40 minutes. Longer than it would have taken most people, shorter than she had expected of him given the shoulder and the night in the cold. When they reached the top of the embankment, he sat on the road edge and breathed. She stood with the cane and waited, because breathing after a difficult ascent was something that deserved its time and not something that should be interrupted or apologized for or hurried past. The dawn was fully established now, gray, cold, the cedar forest emerging from the dark in its full late autumn depth, the fog still present in the lower hollows, but thinning. He said, when he was ready, "Thank you." She said, "Yes." She said, "Can you walk?" He said he thought so. She said the farmhouse was 40 minutes. He said he would manage. She looked at him, the way he was holding himself, the careful stillness in the right side of his torso that indicated he was managing something he had not mentioned. The slight forward tilt of the shoulder that was not how people stand when they are carrying no pain at all, and she said, "We will take the path that does not require your right shoulder to bear weight." He looked at her with something that she would come to recognize over the following days as his version of surprise, which was very contained and very small and appeared primarily as a brief stillness in his expression. He said, "How do you know it's the right shoulder?" She said, "The way you got out of the car." He said nothing. She turned and pointed northeast along the road to where the path began, and they started walking, and the cedar forest received them the way it received everything that moved through it, with complete, unhurried attention and no opinion whatsoever. Chapter 4. The Farmhouse by the Cedar Forest. The farmhouse came into view through the trees as they descended the last section of the ridge path, where the cedars thinned and the path widened and then opened, without much ceremony, onto the cleared ground at the forest's edge where she had built her life. It was a long, low building, dark timber walls, a roof of aged slate tiles that had been repaired in sections over the years so that the color varied slightly from one end to the other. A deep eave overhang that kept the worst of the rain off the entry garden where 3 stone lanterns sat in a line leading to the door. Lamplight showed warm and amber through the shoji screens of the main room. Smoke rose from the stove chimney, thin and straight in the cold morning air. The stone outbuilding at the rear was visible past the corner of the farmhouse, the kiln building, its door closed, the pale stone of its walls catching the early light. He stopped for a moment on the path and looked at it. She let him. She had stopped registering the farmhouse in the way that one registers a thing being seen for the first time, and she found it useful, occasionally, to have someone look at it who did. She showed him the guest room, 8 tatami mats, a low sleeping platform with a futon of considerable weight and warmth, a single lamp on a low table, and a window that faced east into the forest and, in the morning, let in the first light in the specific way that east-facing windows let in dawn light, bright and direct and without the intermediary softening of the shoji screen. So that for the first 40 minutes of daylight, the room was fully illuminated and then the angle changed and it became what it was for the rest of the day, a room of quiet, diffused calm. She brought him a yukata, folded. She said, "Your clothes are wet." He said, "Yes." She said, "Put them on the rack by the stove." She was watching the way he moved, still, the right arm held slightly away from the body, the motion in it careful and controlled. She asked him to raise both arms. He raised them, the right slightly slower than the left. She asked him to grip her hands. He gripped them, both with adequate force, the right marginally less than the left. She said, "Your right shoulder is bruised, not broken." He said, "I know." She said, "Rest it." He said, "I will." She left him the lamp and the yukata and pulled the screen closed and went to the kitchen to make miso soup because it was now nearly 7 in the morning and she had been in the forest for nearly 2 hours and she was hungry. And he had been in an inverted car in a cedar forest for the better part of a night, and he was going to be hungry when he realized it. He slept for the remainder of that day and through the night. She checked on him twice through the afternoon. The second time she stood in the doorway for a moment and observed his breathing, which was even, and the way he was lying, which was on his left side with his right arm supported by the futon, which suggested that even in sleep his body was managing the shoulder appropriately. He was, she decided, someone who listened to his body when the body insisted. The fact that the body had apparently needed to insist quite strenuously before being attended to was a separate matter. On day 2 he woke to the sound of the ceramics wheel. She knew, from inside the back room, the precise moment when he woke, not because she could hear him, but because there was a change in the quality of the farmhouse's interior silence, a slight shift from emptiness to occupancy. The way a room changes when a sleeping person wakes and becomes present in it. She kept working. She was centering a piece of stoneware, and it was at the stage that does not tolerate interruption. She left the internal shoji screen between the ceramics room and the main room slightly open. She did not analyze this decision. She made it and left it. She brought him meals to the guest room for the first 2 days. Ichija sansai, 1 soup, 3 sides, the form constant even if the composition varied. On the first morning, miso soup with wakame and tofu, a small dish of pickled daikon, a dish of grilled mushrooms with ponzu, a bowl of rice. On the first evening, a clear broth with thin strips of root vegetable, a dish of simmered burdock, a small grilled piece of salmon rice. She set the tray on the floor outside the guest room and opened the screen and said, "Eat slowly if your head is uncertain," and closed the screen again. He ate. She knew this because the tray was left outside the screen when she checked it, emptied, with the dishes arranged neatly on it. On the second afternoon, she left the internal shoji screen open while she worked. She was not performing an invitation. She was simply not closing the screen, which is a different thing and achieves the same end with considerably more honesty. From the guest room, she knew, the open screen allowed a view directly into the ceramics room, the wheel and its wooden stand at the center, the shelves along the back wall with their rows of drying pieces at various stages of completion, the tools on the low shelf beside the wheel, the window above the wheel that looked out into the stone outbuilding yard. She worked for 2 hours. At some point she became aware, without looking up, that he was lying on his side on the futon with his face turned toward the open screen. She could not see him from her angle at the wheel, but she could feel the attention. It had a particular quality, focused, quiet, entirely without demand. On day 2 he asked, in the evening, when she brought the tray to the screen opening rather than leaving it outside, "You heard the crash last night." She had been waiting for this, or something like it. She said, "The night before last." He absorbed this. He said, "How long have I been here?" She said, "This is the 2nd evening." He said, "I see." He said, "Did you go out to the road in the dark?" She said, "Before dawn." He said, "Alone?" She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a time and then said, "Thank you." Again. She said, "You said that already." He said, "It seems worth repeating." She almost smiled at that, too, and again did not. Chapter 5. What the Cedar Teaches. His name returned on the morning of day 3. Not all at once, first the name itself, Ishida Kenji, rising to the surface of his consciousness with the clarity of something that had been there all along and simply waiting for the right conditions to reappear. Then the shape of the company, not in its details, but in its mass. Something large, something he had built, something that had obligations. Then, more slowly, the faces. Tanaka Hiromi's carefully composed attention in the boardroom. His daughter Miki's laugh, which was the laugh of someone who found the world genuinely surprising. Furukawa's particular way of presenting information that he now understood, retrospectively, as the performance of transparency rather than the thing itself. He lay on the futon in the gray morning light and let the pieces arrange themselves, and when they were arranged he got up and dressed, carefully, managing the shoulder, and went to find her. He told her, "I remember my name." She looked up from the stove, where she was making tea. She said, "Good." He said, "I remember the rest of it too. Most of it." She said, "Sit down and eat first." He said, "I need to think." She looked at him with the directness she brought to all assessments and said, "You have been thinking for 3 days. The forest is more useful than another hour at the window." She pointed toward the door. On the rack beside it, a simple ashwood walking pole, uncarved, smooth with use. She said, "1 hour. Don't push the shoulder." He took the pole. He went out. The cedar forest in late autumn received him with the same complete indifference with which it received everything. It did not adjust for him. It did not soften or present itself. It was simply there in the full depth of its November self, the trunks rising 20 meters into a canopy that was dark green against a sky of pale, even gray. The forest floor deep in fallen needles that had accumulated over years into a layer that was soft and yielding underfoot and that released when pressed. A smell so clean and deep and slightly sweet that it constituted a full sensory experience in itself rather than merely a background element. The path ran along the ridge in a long, shallow arc, marked at the turns by pale stones that she had placed there herself. He would learn over the course of the first winter. He walked for 20 minutes along the ridge path without thinking about anything specific, which was not an achievement he had managed in the previous 3 days or, he reflected, in many of the days before those. The forest worked on him the way cold water works on an overheated thing, not gently, but effectively. The particular combination of physical movement and sensory specificity, the creak of the upper cedar branches in the wind, the sound of a hawk somewhere high above the canopy, the soft give of the needle carpet underfoot. displaced the mental noise that had been his constant companion for 15 years with something cleaner and less insistent. He stopped at the point where the path bent east and stood in the middle of the forest and did nothing. He did not practice doing nothing. He simply did it, because the forest made it easy, and it was not until he started walking again, 12 minutes later, that he realized what had happened in the interval. He felt, in some peripheral and not quite articulable way, grateful. She was firing the kiln when he returned, the stone outbuilding behind the farmhouse radiating heat, the warmth perceptible from 10 meters in the cold morning air. The clay smell acute and sharp in a way that was quite different from its usual background note in the farmhouse. She stood at the kiln door with a long-handled tool, checking the temperature and the placement of the pieces inside, her attention absolute. He stood at a respectful distance and watched until she turned, which she did after about a minute with the unhurried awareness of someone who notices things in their own time. He asked what she was making. She took him into the back room and showed him the drying shelf. A series of small tea bowls, 7 of them, each one distinct, each one asymmetrical in a way that was clearly not accidental. The asymmetry was not the asymmetry of error, but of decision, each bowl slightly different from a theoretically perfect form in a way that was specific to that bowl and no other. He picked one up, careful of the shoulder, and turned it in his hand. It had a weight that was precisely right in a way he could not have explained, and the slight unevenness of the rim, which he had expected to feel wrong, felt instead like the completion of something, the mark that made the object particular rather than merely functional. He asked, "Why asymmetrical?" She said, "The tea ceremony values the mark of the maker's hand. A perfect bowl is a machine's bowl." He turned it over. On the base, pressed into the clay before firing, a single leaf mark, small and exact, the veining still visible. She said, "From the path above the east ridge." He set it back on the shelf. He looked at the 7 bowls and thought about the idea of the mark of the maker's hand, and the ways in which his own work had, over the 15 years of relentless motion, systematically erased itself of anything that could be called a mark of the maker. The conversations of the middle days accumulated like the needle fall of the cedar forest, slowly, steadily, each one adding to a depth that was only apparent when you considered how different the floor had been at the beginning. In the evenings, after dinner, they sat by the iron stove and talked with the ease of people who have spent enough hours in close proximity that the performance of conversation has been worn away, and what remains is simply the conversation itself. She told him about Kyoto, the university, the department, the particular small drama of a ceramics program within an institution that considered ceramics a subsidiary art. She told him about the students who came in afraid that they would not be able to do it, afraid that the clay would detect their uncertainty and respond accordingly, and about the specific pleasure of sitting with them through the early sessions and watching them discover that the clay did not care about their fear, that it responded to pressure and water and the quality of their attention, and that all of these things were available to anyone willing to show up and pay the kind of attention that showing up requires. He told her about his daughter, Mickey. He said, "She is studying marine biology in Okinawa and she argues with me and wins, which is something that very few people in my professional life have ever done, and which she has been doing since she was approximately 14. She says, 'Your daughter sounds like someone worth knowing.' He said, 'She is the best thing I built and I built nothing, she made herself.'" The words came out before he had time to consider them, and in the silence after them he examined what he had said and found it to be entirely true. She looked at him across the stove warmth and said, "That is either very modest or very wise." He said, "I'm not sure yet." On day 7, she took him to the ridge above the farmhouse where, on clear days, Mount Fuji was visible to the northeast across the Fuji 5 lakes. This was not a clear day. The mountain was completely in cloud, not hidden behind cloud at a distance, but simply absent from the sky, replaced by a uniform gray that gave no indication that anything was behind it. They stood at the ridge together in the cold and looked at the cloud. He said, "I can't see it." She said, "It's there." He said, "That's not very satisfying." She considered this for a moment, and then said, "The mountain does not require your satisfaction." He thought about this for the walk back down to the farmhouse and for some time afterward, and could find no point at which he disagreed. Chapter 6. The Ceramics Room. On the morning of day 8, over breakfast rice, pickled plum, miso soup with clams. The clams sourced from a delivery she received twice a month from a fisherman in Numazu who had been delivering to her for 7 years and who left the boxes at the bottom of the forest path without requiring her to be there. She asked him if he wanted to try the wheel. He set down the miso bowl and looked at her with the careful expression of a man who is not certain whether the question is rhetorical. She waited. He said, "I have never done ceramics in my life." She said, "That is useful. You won't have any habits to undo." She showed him to the ceramics room. The stoneware clay was on the lower shelf, dark, heavy, cool to the touch, with the particular dense smoothness of clay that has been properly prepared. She set a block of it on the wheel bat and showed him how to begin, the hands positioned at 9 and 3, thumbs nearly touching at the top, water from the bowl on the left to maintain slip between hands and clay. She sat at her own workbench section with a new piece of her own and began to talk him through it without looking at him, which was deliberate, because being watched while learning to center clay produces exactly the self-consciousness that prevents centering. She said, "Center the clay first. Press down and in simultaneously down with the left palm and with the right. Use water, but not too much. When you add water, add it to the clay, not to the idea of the clay." She said, "Let the clay tell you what it wants to do before you tell it what you want." He was quiet for a long time after this. She worked on her own piece and listened to the wheel and to his hands on the clay, which told her a great deal about how the centering was going without requiring her to look. The first hour was difficult. The clay went off-center twice, each time producing a wobble that he corrected with too much force, which compounded the problem. The walls of the first attempted bowl rose unevenly and then collapsed in a slow, decisive way that turned the bowl into something between a bowl and an abstract study in the behavior of unsupported clay under insufficient guidance. He said, looking at it, "Well." She said, without looking up, "Try again. Set the bat aside. Take a new piece." He did. The second attempt was better on the centering but worse on the walls. The third attempt achieved centering and lost the walls at a different point. She came to look at the third, which required her to put down the cane and step across to the wheel, which she did without ceremony. She looked at the piece. She said, "The wall is going too fast. Slow the wheel and use less water on the upstroke." She showed him the upstroke with her own hand on a small piece of clay she took from the bench, the particular angle of the palm, the way the pressure was applied from the outside and rather than from the inside out in the early stages of raising the wall. On the fourth attempt, the clay centered. The wheel turned and the clay turned with it in the perfect rotational symmetry that centering produces, the wobble gone, the form steady, the surface of the clay at the top of the centered mass moving with a stillness that was, she had always thought, one of the most beautiful things ceramics produced, the paradox of something spinning so fast that it appears to be perfectly still. He felt it before he recognized it. She could tell by the change in his hands, the slight release of pressure that occurs when a student discovers that the clay is cooperating rather than resisting. The instinctive easing that is the correct response and that most students do not find for several sessions. The wall rose. Slowly, unevenly in places, the thickness varying in ways that would make a ceramicist wince, but upward. A bowl came into being under his hands, not a good bowl by any standard she applied to her own work, the walls too thick, the rim uneven, the base slightly concave in a way that would make it unstable on a flat surface, but a bowl. Unmistakably, irrefutably a bowl. He stopped the wheel and looked at it. She looked at it from her stool, with the honest eye she brought to all assessment. She said, "The rim is interesting." He said, "Interesting is a generous word." She said, "In ceramics, interesting is the highest compliment for a first piece. It means it shows the mark of the person who made it." He held the bowl in both hands carefully. He looked at it the way he had looked at hers on the drying shelf, with the complete attention of someone encountering something for the first time and understanding, in the encounter, something about themselves. He looked at her bowl, which she had returned to and was now in the final stage of shaping, the walls at the height she wanted, the rim being formed with a slow, deliberate touch of the fingertip that drew the clay upward in a thin, even arc. He watched her hands. The clay moved under them with the quality of something that knew where it was going and was being accompanied there rather than pushed. He thought about that word, accompanying. He had spent 22 years leading things, directing them, deciding the direction, and then ensuring everything moved in it. The architecture of his entire professional existence had been built on the premise that forward motion requires initiation, that initiation requires decision, and that decision requires the certainty of someone who has stopped leaving room for doubt. He had been very good at all of this. He had built a company that was a testament to all of this. He was beginning to understand, spent 22 years in a room he had made so airtight that nothing new had been able to get in. He said, without particularly planning to, "What happened to the plants from your Kyoto apartment?" She looked up. She was clearly not expecting this specific question, which had come from somewhere he was not entirely sure of himself. She said, "I gave them away before I left." He said, "All of them." She paused. She said, "Most of them." She said, "I kept one. A small juniper." She paused again and then said, "It's on the windowsill in the guest room." He turned and looked through the internal screen, through the open main room, to the window of the guest room that faced the cedar forest. On the sill, in a small handmade ceramic pot of deep green-gray, a juniper, compact and perfectly alive, 8 or 9 centimeters high. He had been sleeping in that room for 8 days. He had looked out that window every morning. He had not noticed it until this moment. He said, "I've been in that room for 8 days." She said, "Yes." He said, "I didn't see it." She returned to the bowl and said, "You were looking at the forest." He said, "You would think I'd notice something right in front of me." She said, and there was no judgment in it, only the simple precision of a person who has thought about this for a long time. "You notice what you are looking for." She said, "This is true for most things." She said it and then attended to the bowl again, and the wheel turned, and neither of them said anything else for quite a long time, which was, as she had found was often the case, exactly the right response. Chapter 7, Mount Fuji in the Cloud. On the evening of day 10, she made nabemono on the iron stove, a simple hot pot, a ceramic pot of good weight that she had made herself 6 years ago in a shape specifically suited to the stove top, into which went mushrooms of 3 kinds from the forest margin, tofu in thick squares, burdock roots sliced thin, shiitake, winter chrysanthemum greens, a broth made from kombu that she had soaking since the previous day. The hot pot on the stove created the particular quality of warmth and smell that transforms the inside of a small room in cold weather into something that feels, whatever the circumstances outside, like shelter that is not merely physical. He set the low table while she worked, which she let him do because the shoulder was clearly better and because setting the low table was a task that required no instruction. The conversation that began over dinner was the deepest they had. It began simply. She asked about the early years of the company, not the public version she could have found on any business database, but the human version, what the first 2 years had actually felt like. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was deciding whether to answer, and then she understood from his face that he was simply trying to find the accurate words for something he had not described in a very long time. He said, "I started with almost nothing," which is the standard version of the story and is also true. He said, "What I don't usually include in that story is that I was afraid every single day for the first 8 years." He said, "Not the kind of fear that impedes action, the kind that accelerates it. The kind where the fear of stopping is greater than the fear of the thing in front of you. So you keep going, and the going produces results, and the results look like courage from the outside, but from the inside they look like running." He stopped and looked at the hot pot and said, "At some point the fear became habit, and the habit became drive, and the drive became the company, and then I stopped being able to tell the difference between what I was doing because I chose it and what I was doing because I had forgotten that there was an alternative." She listened to this with complete attention, which meant her face was still and her hands were still, and she was not preparing a response while he spoke. She waited until he was fully finished and the silence had settled. Then she said, "How long has it been like this?" He considered. He said, 15 years, perhaps. Closer to 15 than to 10. She said, "What would you have done instead?" He looked at the question from several angles and said, "I don't know. I stopped asking it a very long time ago." And then, before she could respond, "That's the most honest thing I've said since I arrived, isn't it?" She said, "Yes." And he looked at that honesty the way he had looked at the tea bowl, with recognition and without flinching. She told him about the stroke. She said, "I was 42 on the outside, and I was living at a pace that felt like ambition and looked like commitment and was, I understand now, neither of those things." She said, "It was avoidance at speed. I was very busy and very competent, and I was avoiding something I could not name, which is, perhaps, the most common human condition and also the one we are least willing to describe accurately." She said the stroke had been mild. Clinically speaking, she said this without inflection, as a simple contextual fact, and that it had required her to relearn how she moved through the world, which had taken 2 years of what she described only as sustained effort and would not elaborate on beyond that. She said, "I am not glad it happened. I want to be clear about that. I do not hold with the idea that difficult things happen for the good of the person they happen to." She said, "But I am glad for what I found on the other side of it." He said, "The forest and the ceramics." She considered this. She said, "And the time." She said, "Time is not something I was ever good at having. I had schedules and deadlines and commitments and a calendar that was an architectural structure of obligation, and none of it was time." She said, "I am better at having time now. I am not all the way to good at it, but I am better." She looked at the stove and said, "The forest helps. The ceramics help. Having 11 years of practice helps most of all." He said, "I don't know how to have time." She said, "I know." He said, "Is it something that can be learned?" She said, "Everything can be learned." He said, "At 48. She said, "Especially at 48. She said, "The people who learn it young don't understand what they've learned. They have it without knowing the cost of not having it, which means they will lose it without knowing what they've lost. At 48 you understand exactly what you're getting and exactly what you've been without, and those two understandings together make the learning permanent in a way it cannot be when you are young and haven't yet experienced the alternative." He was quiet for a long time after this. The hot pot simmered. The cedar outside moved in the wind. She could hear it, the low collective voice of the upper canopy in the dark, a sound she had come to find the most companionable thing in the world. He asked, into the silence, "What is the cane made of?" The question came out of nowhere that she could identify and seemed to come out of nowhere that he could identify either. She looked at the cane leaning against the table beside her. She said, "White oak. From the forest path above the East Ridge. A branch that came down in a windstorm 6 winters ago." She said, "The right thickness, the right density." I dried it for 2 winters in the stone outbuilding and shaped it over the following summer with hand tools. He said, "You made it yourself." She said, "I needed it to be the right weight." No one else could have known what the right weight was. He reached across the table and she let him pick it up, the white oak cane, aged and smooth, the grain of the wood visible along the shaft, the slight imperfections of handwork present in the finish in a way that made it entirely different in the hand from anything that had been machined. He turned it and felt the balance of it, the way it sat in his grip. He held it for a moment in the stove-lit warmth of the farmhouse and then handed it back carefully. He said, "It's very good." She accepted it back and settled it against the table and said, "It took a long time to get right." She said, "Most things do." And on the stove the pot simmered, and outside the cedar forest moved in the dark, and neither of them felt the need to add anything further for a long and comfortable time. Chapter 8. The Clear Morning. The memory returned fully on the morning of day 12. He was standing at the guest room window, watching the mist on the cedar forest in the early light, the mist moving through the trees in slow, deliberate currents, catching the thin morning sun in the upper cedars and making the canopy glow with a diffuse, sourceless light when it arrived, between one breath and the next, with the completeness of a thing that had been approaching for a while and had simply chosen its moment. Ishida Kenji. Ishida Holdings. The consolidated evidence file on the external hard drive in the laptop bag in the inverted car on the Cedar embankment. Furukawa Daisuke, 9 years of trusted service and the specific, cold-edged clarity of understanding exactly how that trust had been used. Tanaka Hiromi, his general counsel, who would by now have been operating for 11 days with the full weight of a critical case and a missing president and no word of explanation, and who was, he was certain, completely, without question, not the kind of person who wasted time being alarmed when being methodical was available as an alternative. He stood at the window and allowed the full shape of his life to reassemble itself in his mind, piece by piece, and he was aware of 2 things simultaneously. First, that the life was extremely large and extremely demanding and was going to come back for him with complete efficiency the moment he made contact with it, and second, that the 11 days he had just spent in a farmhouse at the edge of a cedar forest above Lake Psycho were the most peaceful 11 days of the past 15 years. Possibly of the past 20, and that this was not a coincidence and was not a function of the concussion, and was not something he was prepared to dismiss or attribute to novelty or to the particular charm of convalescence. It was real, and it was the consequence of being in a specific place with a specific person who had built a specific life, and it was going to remain true after he left, whether he chose to carry it or not. He found her in the ceramics room, trimming the base of a fired bowl with a small tool that moved against the surface in careful, short arcs, removing the rough edge at the foot ring with the patience of someone who understands that the last 5% of a piece takes as much time as the first 95. He stood in the doorway. He said her name. She looked up and she saw his face and she understood what she was seeing, the particular expression of someone who has come back to themselves fully and knows it, and she put down the trimming tool on the low shelf without looking where she put it, which said something about how well she knew the room and gave him her full attention. He told her everything. He talked for 20 minutes, steadily, in the way that a man talks when he is telling the actual version of a story rather than the version he presents in boardrooms. The company, its structure, the 14 months of legal work, the consortium, Furukawa's role, the road, the blockade, the reason for the hard drive, and what its contents meant for 3 people who had operated for 14 months on the assumption that what they had done could not be demonstrated. She listened without interruption. She asked no questions during it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "The hard drive. Is it still in the car?" He said, "I believe so." She said, "Then we should go and get it before the rain tonight." He looked at her. He said, "You're already thinking about the next problem." She said, I am always thinking about the next problem. He said, that sounds familiar. She said, yes. I expect it does. And something in the economy of that exchange, in its directness and its complete absence of performance, produced in him a smile that had nothing professional about it at all. They went to the car together. She led him on a different path down to the embankment than the one she had used on the morning of the rescue, a longer path, gentler in grade, which followed the drainage of the slope rather than crossing it, requiring far less of the shoulder and of her right side. The descent took 40 minutes, which was the right amount of time. The forest received them in the manner it always received her, with the stillness of something that had been here long before either of them and would be here long after, and that made no adjustment for their presence, but did not withhold itself either. The car had settled further into the cedar undergrowth in 12 days. The forest was already adjusting to it. A small cedar sapling that had been displaced in the crash had begun to right itself, its tip reaching upward again with the patient insistence of green things. Cedar needles had drifted across the exposed undercarriage. The single headlight had finally died. He stood and looked at it for a long moment, the car he had driven on mountain roads for its control and its responsiveness, now resident in the cedar forest, and felt nothing dramatic about it, which seemed right. He retrieved the laptop bag from the interior. The zipper was intact. The hard drive was there. He held it in one hand and looked at it and thought about the 14 months it represented, and about Tanaka Hiromi, and about what came next. On the ridge, the signal was 2 bars, but sufficient. His calls were brief and careful, security first, then Tanaka Hiromi, who answered on the second ring and delivered, in the space of 4 minutes. A complete situational briefing with the precision and economy of someone who had been expecting this call and had been ready for it. He descended from the ridge with the pole in one hand and the laptop bag over the left shoulder, and the cold of the approaching rain front moving through the cedars in long gusts that smelled of the lake below and the distance beyond it. His security team arrived the following morning in 3 black cars on the forestry road above, their tires audible from inside the farmhouse before they were visible. His head of security, a taciturn man named Okamoto who had been with him for 8 years and who expressed the full range of his professional emotions through minimal variation in the set of his jaw, came down the forest path and found him on the front step of the farmhouse drinking bancha, and the expression on Okamoto's face at finding him there, alive, unhurt beyond the shoulder, in a yukata over a fleece layer, drinking tea in the cold morning air, was something he had not previously seen. On Okamoto's face, and which he found deeply, unexpectedly touching. He thanked Okamoto and the team and asked them to wait. He went inside. She was in the ceramics room. He stood in the doorway and said her name, and she came out, cane in hand, and faced him in the main room in the early morning light that came through the shoji screens in its diffused way, the light she had described as the most beautiful quality of light in the world, and he understood now exactly what she meant. He said, "They're here." She said, "I heard the cars." He said, "I have to go." She said, "Yes." He said, "I don't want to." She considered this without deflecting it. She received it as the direct, simple statement it was, and she said, "I know." And then she said, "You'll carry it with you." He looked at her. He said, "Yes." She said, "Then go." He asked, "May I take the bowl?" She went to the drying shelf and picked up the tea bowl from day 8, the first one, the one with the thick rim and the unstable base and the cedar leaf pressed into the side, and she wrapped it carefully in cloth from the shelf beneath the wheel and gave it to him. She said, "It's not balanced." He said, "I know." She said, "That is what makes it yours." He held it in both hands and looked at her for a long moment in the beautiful morning light of the farmhouse and said, "You are an extraordinary person." She said, "Go and do what you built." He said, "And you?" She looked around the farmhouse, the shoji screens, the stove, the ceramics room, and she said, "I am doing it." Chapter 9. What the Cedar Kept. Osaka received him like an urgent tide, which was what Osaka always was, a city in motion, the motion continuous and purposeful, the purpose layered and interconnected and immediate. The black car from the airport moved through the expressway traffic in the early afternoon, the city rising on either side in its familiar way, the density of it, the verticality. The particular quality of afternoon light on glass and concrete that was so entirely different from the quality of light on cedar bark and shoji screen that the comparison seemed almost absurd. He sat in the back seat with the laptop bag on his knees and looked at the city and felt, for the first time in as long as he could remember, that he was someone who was choosing to go toward something rather than someone who had simply never stopped moving. There were 11 meetings in the first 2 days, which was fewer than there could have been and more than enough. Furukawa's role was documented with the thorough care that Tanaka Hiromi brought to everything, and referred to the relevant authorities with the particular precision of someone who has made certain that every fact is in its correct place before it is committed to. The consortium fractured along the fault lines that she had predicted 14 months earlier in a preliminary memorandum that he had read and approved and filed. 3 principles exposed, 1 cooperating. The structure of the market manipulation provable now through the evidence on the hard drive and through the secondary trail that she had, in his absence, painstakingly rebuilt from what she had. She described the outcome of the secondary trail work, in her customary fashion, as gratifying in its precision. He thanked her. She said, "It's what I do." He said, "Yes, and I want you to know I know that." She was quiet for a moment in a way that told him this was not something she had expected him to say, and he filed that information away for later consideration. The board stabilized. The vote, challenged on 3 grounds, was suspended pending the outcome of the legal proceedings. The evidence file filled the gap that nothing else could have filled. The case moved forward with the momentum of something that has been correctly assembled and correctly aimed, and the consortium's legal team, whom he had always respected as formidable, began, with the particular visible dignity of the formidably defeated, to manage their position rather than to contest it. He watched this process with the competence he brought to all such things, and with the underlying awareness, constant, quiet, entirely new, that the most important 2 weeks of the past 15 years had been spent not in this office, but in a farmhouse at the edge of a cedar forest, with a woman who had gone out alone in the dark before dawn because she had heard a sound and decided to find its source. He could not contact her directly. The legal proceedings made direct contact inadvisable. Furukawa's lawyers were pursuing every angle that might serve their client, and he would not give them anything that could be characterized as anything other than what it was. So he worked indirectly, which she had taught him was often the better approach, not the shortest line between 2 points, but the line that encountered no resistance, because it moved through the space where resistance was not present. The cedar forest above Lake Saiko received, through a Regional Arts and Heritage Foundation, a grant for the documentation and preservation of traditional forest craft techniques in the Fuji 5 Lakes region. The grant was specific. It focused on the traditional use of forest materials in the making of tools and implements, specifically, the knowledge of wood types, curing methods, and shaping techniques that had been practiced in the mountain communities of Yamanashi Prefecture for generations, and which had gone underfunded for 2 decades. The knowledge existing now primarily in the hands of people who had learned it in a period when it was still considered ordinary, and who were not going to be around forever. The grant funded documentation, publication, and a public access archive. It was not a large grant by the standards of the things he funded. It was precisely sized for its purpose. A regional arts program in Yamanashi Prefecture received, through a separate foundation, funding for a ceramics fellowship. The fellowship was designed for working ceramicists in rural areas who were operating outside institutional frameworks, people who had built their practice in isolation. Without the institutional support or the metropolitan gallery infrastructure that urban artists could access, and who were producing work of genuine quality with no mechanism for it to reach the people who would value it. The fellowship was fully funded, without conditions of relocation. The ceramicist could remain where they were. The point was that they should have room to continue. The fellowship had 3 recipients in its first year. He did not know the names of the other 2. He knew one name. A small ceramics gallery in Tokyo, a gallery whose director had been identified over the course of 3 weeks of careful research by a deputy whose judgment he trusted on such matters, as someone with a specific combination of aesthetic intelligence and commercial capability that would serve the work rather than simply present it, received an anonymous submission. For pieces, shipped in careful packing from a Yamanashi prefecture postal address, submitted by a post office box. For tea bowls, each asymmetrical, each bearing the mark of a maker whose hand was completely recognizable across all 4 pieces and completely unlike anyone in the gallery's existing program. The director wrote back with an offer of representation. The letter was detailed, serious, and specific about what representation would and would not require. The response, when it came, arrived handwritten on plain paper. It said, "Thank you. I will consider it." She read the letter from the gallery twice at the low table by the window, and then a 3rd time, and looked out at the cedar forest for a long time. She knew, or nearly knew. The pattern of it had the quality of things arranged by someone who understood indirectness, and there were not many people who understood her work and also understood indirectness. She knew of one. She did not require confirmation, which was convenient, because confirmation was not available, and she had lived for 11 years with the knowledge that many things worth knowing are not available for direct verification, and that this was not a reason to doubt them. She put the gallery letter on the low shelf beneath the sketchbooks and went to the ceramics room and began a new piece. She worked for 2 hours without stopping, and the piece, when she looked at it, was the best bowl she had made in 3 years. She was not certain of the reason for this. She had some thoughts about it that she did not examine too closely, because some things are like the mountain on a cloudy day, better understood through the certainty that they are there than through the frustration of needing to see them clearly. He kept the tea bowl on his desk in Osaka, on the right side, where his right hand rested when he read. It held, over time, a small collection, a smooth gray stone from the cedar forest floor, picked up on the morning he had waited on the ridge for the signal, a single dried cedar sprig from the path above the east ridge, a cedar leaf pressed flat, its veining still clear. His personal assistant, who had worked with him for 12 years and whose understanding of him was by this point approximately as accurate as such understanding can be between 2 people who have worked together long and well, looked at the collection one afternoon in November and said nothing. Her silence was the kind of silence that contains complete comprehension, and he received it as such. He had not told her anything about it. He did not need to. She knew that something had changed in him between the day he drove out of Osaka on a mountain road and the day Okamoto's security team brought him back. And she had noted the change with the careful attention of someone who files useful information in the correct place and does not make the error of pressing on it before it is ready. The bowl on the desk told her something. The stone and the cedar sprig told her something. The 40-minute call with his daughter, the longest they had heard in 3 years, conducted with the office door closed, from which he emerged with the particular expression of someone who has said things they had been meaning to say for a long time, told her something more. Nikki had called from Okinawa on a Tuesday evening, when the light over Osaka Bay was fading and the office had gone quiet around him the way it went quiet when he stayed past the point where most people would have left. They talked for 40 minutes, which was longer than they had talked in a single conversation in 3 years, and which covered territory that their conversations usually did not reach. The marine biology program and what it was actually like rather than what the reports said it was like. His daughter's assessment of a research trip to the Kerama Islands and why it had made her want to work in deep water rather than in a laboratory. His own assessment of several things he had not previously assessed aloud, including the proposition that he had been confusing relentlessness with virtue for a significant portion of his life, and had recently found himself in a position to observe this from the outside, which was an uncomfortable position and also an irreplaceable one. Mickey had listened to this and said, "You sound different." He said, "Do I?" She said, "More like yourself." He said, "I found something I'd put down a long time ago." She said, "Was it good?" He said, "It was very good." She said, "Are you going to find it again?" He looked at the bowl on his desk, the uneven rim, the unstable base, the cedar leaf pressed into the side by hands that understood exactly what they were doing, and he said, "Yes." He did not go back immediately. The legal proceedings required proximity to Osaka, and then the post-proceedings stabilization required attention, and then it was the new year and the cycle of the company turned again with its complete and demanding momentum. He carried the 11 days in the cedar forest the way she had said he would carry it, not as memory exactly, but as orientation, as a point from which distance could be measured. He made decisions differently, or began to. He left spaces in the day that he had not previously left, small at first, then larger, spaces in which he did not pursue the next thing, but sat with the thing he had just done and let it be finished before beginning what came next. His personal assistant noted this. She said nothing about it. Her silence was eloquent in the way it always was. From his office above Osaka, quietly and carefully and one thing at a time, he continued to ensure that what she had built, the forest, the craft, the 11 years of patient and extraordinary practice, had room to continue. He did this with the same care he brought to the things that mattered most to him, thoroughly, without display, without requiring acknowledgement, without any of the noise that he had spent 22 years confusing with purpose. The Ceramics Fellowship paid its second year of support in the spring. The Forest Documentation Archive published its first set of materials in the summer. The gallery in Tokyo opened a small show in October, 6 pieces, a single wall, almost no text, the work speaking in the specific way that very good work speaks when it has been allowed to stand on its own terms. The cedar forest above Lake Saiko was still there. It was always still there. It did not move, and it did not worry, and it did not pursue the next thing. It received what came to it, the seasons, the animals, the weather, the occasional human being on a forest path at dawn, the occasional overturned car in its undergrowth, and it kept what it kept and let the rest pass through. It had kept everything she gave it over 11 years. The paths she had walked into it, the hours of attention she had paid to it, the drawings in 37 sketchbooks, the 2 winters of drying oak wood in the stone outbuilding, the knowledge of where each section of the ridge path changed underfoot and what the change meant. It had kept all of this in the way that forests keep things, not preserving them unchanged, but holding them within the ongoing process of their own becoming, which was not the same as loss. And he was keeping her. Not in the way that is about possession or proximity or the satisfaction of completion. In the way that is about carrying the thing that changed the direction of your attention and choosing, every day, to carry it faithfully. The bowl on the right side of his desk. The stone from the forest floor. The cedar sprig from the east ridge path. The specific quality of a morning in late autumn when the air is cold and sharp and the cedar smell is everywhere and the mountain above the lake is invisible in cloud and completely, undeniably there. He had started looking for more things. From an office above Osaka, quietly and one thing at a time, Ishida Kenji was learning to notice what was right in front of him. World Stories Series, Episode 3, The Mountain Road He Never Chose.